Georgia, January 1837, Baldwin County, Sweetwater Plantation. Jonathan Harper seized Hannah by the throat, slammed her against the wall, and turned to his wife with dead, empty eyes. "Write it down," he said. "Everything." Elizabeth's pen was shaking so violently the ink bled across the page. She was not recording livestock. She was recording a human being her husband intended to breed like one. And she, his wife, was the only witness he trusted enough to watch. If this story shook something in you, subscribe to this channel right now and follow every word to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Elizabeth Harper had never thought of herself as a weak woman. She had grown up in Savannah, the daughter of a merchant who taught her to read contracts before she could braid her own hair. She could manage a household, argue prices with a supplier, and smile through the kind of social cruelty that wealthy Southern women inflicted on each other with such practiced grace it barely left a mark. She was not soft. She had never been soft. But nothing in her life had prepared her for the night Jonathan brought the ledger to her bedside table and set it down like it was a Bible. It was December of 1836. The doctor had left only 2 hours before. The diagnosis had been delivered in the dry, clinical tone that doctors of that era reserved for bad news they did not feel personally obligated to soften. The word he used was barren. He said it once, and then said it again, as if Elizabeth might not have heard him the first time. She had heard him. Jonathan had stood by the window during the entire examination. He had not reached for her hand. He had not looked at her. He had simply stood there, staring out at the cotton fields that stretched to the edge of the horizon. And when the doctor finally left, Jonathan stood in silence for a very long time. Then he turned around, and the look on his face was not grief. It was calculation. "You understand what this means," he said. It was not a question. Elizabeth looked at him from the bed. "Jonathan, the Harper name requires an heir," he said, cutting her off with the precision of a man who had already decided the conversation was over before it began. "I have given this plantation everything. My father gave it everything before me. I will not allow what we built here to die because of a medical inconvenience." She stared at him. "A medical inconvenience?" "That is what I said." She sat up slowly. "Jonathan, I have just been told I cannot have children. Do you understand what that means to me? Do you have any understanding at all of—" "I understand it completely," he said, "and I have already thought of a solution." That was the moment. That single sentence. That was the moment Elizabeth Harper should have understood exactly who her husband was. But the mind protects itself. The heart resists what it cannot afford to believe. And so she told herself that he meant adoption, or a nephew, or some legal arrangement that wealthy men sometimes made when dynasties were at stake. She was wrong. She would not understand how wrong until 1 month later, when Jonathan came to her sitting room carrying that leather-bound ledger and set it in her lap with the same expression a man might wear when presenting a business plan to a reluctant partner. "Open it," he said. The first page had a column for names, a column for age, a column for physical description, a column for what Jonathan had labeled, in his careful, slanted handwriting, temperament. And at the bottom of the first page, in smaller letters, a category that made Elizabeth's stomach turn over slowly: breeding suitability. She closed the book. "What is this?" she whispered. Jonathan sat down across from her and crossed one leg over the other with the casual ease of a man who expected no serious resistance. "It is a record," he said. "A scientific record. You will keep it. You will observe the women I select and document their health, their constitution, their intelligence as best you can measure it. You will note pregnancies, births, and the qualities of each child as they develop. Elizabeth set the ledger on the table between them very carefully, the way you set down something that might explode. "You are not serious." "I am always serious."
"Jonathan, these are human beings."
"They are property," he said. Not with cruelty. That was the worst part. He said it with the same tone he used when correcting a misunderstanding about crop yields, as a simple matter of established fact. "And I intend to manage my property with the same intelligence I apply to everything else on this plantation." Elizabeth stood up. "I will not do this." Jonathan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, "You will. Because the alternative is that I commit you to the Georgia Lunatic Asylum on the grounds of emotional instability following your medical diagnosis. I have already spoken to Dr. Perkins about the paperwork. It would take less than a week." The room was completely silent. Elizabeth could hear her own breathing. "You wouldn't," she said. "Sit down," Jonathan said. "Pick up the pen." She sat down. She picked up the pen. And that was how Elizabeth Harper became the record keeper of Sweetwater Plantation's darkest secret. The first woman Jonathan selected was named Hannah. She was 23 years old, had been born on the plantation, and had dark eyes that Elizabeth noticed immediately held a particular quality of stillness, the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from years of learning to make yourself invisible. Hannah stood in the center of the room while Jonathan circled her the way a man might assess a horse at auction, and Elizabeth sat in the corner with the ledger open on her knee and her pen in her hand. And she wrote down everything Jonathan told her to write. She told herself she was only writing words, that writing was not the same as doing, that she was not responsible for what her husband chose to do. She would spend the rest of her life trying to make herself believe that. Hannah was not the last. 2 weeks later, Jonathan selected a young woman from the kitchen staff named Mary. She was 19 and had a quick intelligence that Jonathan noted with what Elizabeth could only describe as professional satisfaction. He made Elizabeth record the sharpness of Mary's memory, the way she could repeat instructions after hearing them only once, the steadiness of her hands. "These qualities pass through blood," Jonathan told Elizabeth one evening, as if explaining a lecture to a student. "A man who understands that understands the future of this country." "You sound like a monster," Elizabeth said. Jonathan did not even look up from the journal he was reading. "I sound like a scientist," he said. That was when a letter arrived from South Carolina. The man who wrote it signed his name Dr. Edward Caldwell. He described himself as a researcher with interests in human heredity and what he called the systematic improvement of labor stock. He had read a paper Jonathan had apparently circulated in private correspondence among certain plantation owners in Georgia and the Carolinas, a paper Elizabeth had not known existed until that moment. And he was, he wrote, deeply interested in collaboration. Jonathan read the letter twice at the breakfast table, and then looked up at Elizabeth with something in his eyes that she had never seen before and did not have a name for. It was not quite excitement. It was not quite pride. It was something colder than both. "He is coming in the spring," Jonathan said. Elizabeth set down her coffee cup. "Who is he?" "A man who understands what I am building here." "What are you building, Jonathan?" she asked. She asked it quietly, the way you ask a question when part of you already suspects the answer and is trying to decide whether you want to hear it spoken aloud. Jonathan folded the letter and tucked it into his breast pocket. "Something that will outlast both of us," he said. By April of 1837, 3 more women had been selected and recorded in the ledger. By June, the first pregnancy had been documented. Jonathan walked through the plantation quarters with the focused energy of a man overseeing a successful harvest, and Elizabeth followed behind him with the ledger pressed against her chest like a shield that she knew could not protect her from anything. Mary gave birth in August, a boy.
Jonathan examined the child with a thoroughness that made Elizabeth turn away. He noted the child's features. He estimated the tone of his skin.
He dictated observations about the shape of the infant's hands and head that Elizabeth had to close her eyes to write. When Jonathan left the room, Elizabeth looked down at the baby in Mary's arms. Mary was staring at her with an expression that Elizabeth had seen on the faces of the enslaved women more and more frequently in recent months. It was not hatred. It was not pleading. It was something more devastating than either. It was knowledge. Mary knew exactly what Elizabeth was. She knew that Elizabeth understood what was happening here. She knew that Elizabeth had the pen and the ledger and access to her husband's correspondence and the social standing to walk out of this plantation and into a courthouse and speak. She knew all of that. And she knew that Elizabeth had not done it. Elizabeth walked out of the room without saying a word. That night, she sat alone at her writing desk for a very long time. She opened the ledger to the first page and read through every entry she had made since December, every name, every observation, every clinical note in her own handwriting that documented what her husband had done to these women. And then, very quietly, she opened the bottom drawer of her desk. She took out a second, smaller notebook that Jonathan did not know existed, and she began to write something different. Not what Jonathan told her to write, what she actually saw. She wrote Hannah's name in full. She wrote the date of the first night. She wrote what she had witnessed with a specificity and honesty that made her hand tremble on every sentence. She wrote Mary's name. She wrote the baby's name, which Mary had whispered to herself in the corner of the room, a name Jonathan had not asked for and did not record in his ledger. The baby's name was Thomas. Elizabeth wrote it down. She did not know yet what she would do with what she was writing. She did not have a plan. She had only the pen and the paper and the unbearable weight of being a witness who had not yet found the courage to be anything more. But she kept writing, and somewhere on this plantation, in a world that Jonathan Harper had constructed entirely around his own certainty that he was above judgment, a clock had begun to tick. The second notebook was Elizabeth's only secret in a house where Jonathan controlled everything else. She hid it beneath a loose floorboard under her writing desk, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp Georgia winters. Every night, after Jonathan retired to his study, she would pull it out and write by candlelight until her fingers cramped. She wrote names. She wrote dates. She wrote what she had seen and what she suspected, and what she could not yet prove, but knew in her bones to be true. She told herself it was just a record. She told herself she was not yet brave enough to do anything with it. But somewhere beneath that excuse, in a place she could not quite look at directly, she understood that she was building something. A case, a testimony, a weapon she did not yet know how to use. It was the arrival of Dr. Edward Caldwell in the spring of 1838 that changed everything. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in a carriage that was too expensive for a man of science and not expensive enough for a man of leisure, which told Elizabeth immediately that he occupied the particular category of Southern gentlemen she distrusted most. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, thin, with the kind of precise, deliberate movements that suggested a man who had spent a great deal of his life trying to project authority over rooms that did not naturally grant it to him. He had small, careful eyes. He shook Jonathan's hand at the front steps with the warmth of old friends reuniting, though Elizabeth had never heard Jonathan mention his name before the letter. "Mrs. Harper," Caldwell said, turning to her with a practiced smile. "Your husband speaks of your assistance with great admiration." Elizabeth looked at him steadily. "Does he?" Caldwell smiled wider. "A man of science requires a methodical partner. Jonathan is fortunate." Elizabeth said nothing. She had learned by then that silence was sometimes the only form of resistance available to her.
That evening at dinner, she listened while Jonathan and Caldwell talked with an ease and fluency that told her they had been corresponding for far longer than she knew. They spoke in the careful, euphemistic language of men who understood they were discussing something the polite world would not endorse. They called it selective cultivation. They called it generational improvement. They called it with a casualness that made Elizabeth grip her fork until her knuckles whitened. The natural science of human potential. The problem with the current system, Caldwell said, cutting his meat with surgical precision, is that it is entirely reactive. Men buy and sell what already exists. No one is thinking ahead. No one is asking what could be created. Jonathan nodded. That is precisely what I said in the paper. And you are right. You are entirely right. Caldwell set down his fork and leaned forward slightly. There are buyers in Havana, Jonathan, in Rio. Men with more money than they know what to do with, who want something specific. Something they cannot find on any current market. He paused. Children who can move between worlds. Do you understand what I'm saying? Elizabeth looked up. Jonathan noticed her looking and shifted the conversation immediately, asking Caldwell about his journey from Charleston. But the damage was done. Elizabeth had heard enough. She had understood exactly what Caldwell meant by children who could move between worlds. He meant children with light enough skin to pass. Children who could be placed in households, in businesses, in positions of proximity to wealth and power. Children whose origins no one would question because no one would be able to see those origins at a glance. She went to bed that night and did not sleep. The next morning, Jonathan gave her a new instruction for the ledger. He wanted a separate column added for what he described, with no visible discomfort, as projected marketability. I want you to understand, he told her at the breakfast table while Caldwell was still upstairs, that what we are doing here will outlive both of us. The work that Caldwell and I are building together is scientific history. You are selling children, Elizabeth said. The words came out before she could stop them, flat, direct, stripped of the careful indirection she had been practicing for over a year. Jonathan looked at her for a long moment. I am managing resources, he said, which is what I have always done, which is what this plantation has always required. They are not resources, she said. They are Elizabeth. His voice dropped to the register she had learned to be afraid of, the quiet one. We have had this conversation. I told you then, and I will tell you once more, and only once more, what the alternative looks like for you. Do you need me to describe it again? She did not answer. He nodded, picked up his coffee, and left the room. That afternoon, Caldwell asked to review the ledger personally. Jonathan handed it to him without hesitation. Elizabeth stood near the window and watched the doctor turn the pages with the focused attention of a man reading a text that genuinely excited him, pausing occasionally to make small sounds of approval, tapping certain entries with one finger as if marking them for future reference. This one, Caldwell said, pointing to an entry near the middle of the book. Mary, the kitchen woman, the child born last August. Thomas, Elizabeth said before she could stop herself. Both men looked at her. That is his name, she said. The child's name is Thomas. There was a silence. Caldwell smiled at her with something behind his eyes that was not warmth. Mrs. Harper, he said, names are a comfort we extend to those whose futures we intend to determine ourselves. It is a kindness, in fact, not to name what you cannot keep. Elizabeth stared at him. Thomas is 8 months old, she said. His mother calls him Thomas. His name is Thomas. Jonathan said, that's enough. But something had shifted in that room. Caldwell looked at Elizabeth with a new kind of attention after that, the way a man looks at a variable he has not previously accounted for. That night, Elizabeth wrote 3 full pages in the hidden notebook. She wrote Caldwell's name. She wrote what he had said at dinner. She wrote the word Havana. She wrote the word Rio. She wrote the phrase, "children who can move between worlds," and underlined it twice.
Then she sat still for a long time and thought about what she was actually willing to do. It was 2 weeks later, on a heavy, airless July evening, that Hannah came to find her. Not to the main house. Hannah would not come to the main house by choice. She found Elizabeth in the narrow passage between the kitchen outbuilding and the laundry, where Elizabeth sometimes walked alone in the late afternoon to escape the suffocating company of the two men who had turned her home into a laboratory. Hannah stepped out of the shadow and looked at her, and Elizabeth stopped walking. They stood facing each other in silence for a moment. They had not spoken directly, not really spoken, since that first terrible night in December of 1836. "You're writing things down," Hannah said, not a question. Elizabeth's heart clenched. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Hannah's voice was low and completely steady. "I've seen the light under your door at night. The other book."
"Not the one he gave you, the one he doesn't know about." Elizabeth did not move, did not breathe. "I don't know what you plan to do with it," Hannah said. "Maybe nothing. Maybe you're writing it for yourself so you can sleep at night. I don't know." She paused. "But I need you to write something specific. I need you to write down what happened to Lydia's baby." Elizabeth felt something cold move through her. "What happened to Lydia's baby?" Hannah looked at her with those still, knowing eyes. "She was told the baby was sold to a family in Savannah," she said. 3 weeks after it was born. But 2 nights before the baby disappeared, I saw a wagon arrive from the direction of the Milledgeville Road. After dark. No lanterns." She stopped. "That baby was never sold to any family in Savannah." The silence between them stretched long and taut. "How many?" Elizabeth asked. Hannah did not answer immediately. She looked past Elizabeth for a moment into the middle distance, with the expression of someone doing a count they have done many times before and have never been able to finish without it costing them something. "Since I have been old enough to notice," Hannah said finally, "at least 7. Maybe more before that." She paused. "The mothers are told different stories, sold to different places, but the wagons always come at night. And the men driving them are not from any plantation nearby. I have never seen their faces twice." Elizabeth pressed her hand flat against the wall beside her to keep herself steady. "Caldwell," she said. Hannah said nothing. She did not need to. Elizabeth went back inside and straight to her writing desk. She did not eat dinner that night. She did not respond when Jonathan knocked on her door to ask if she was unwell. She sat at that desk until nearly midnight, and she wrote down everything Hannah had told her, every word, every detail, the wagon, the road, the darkness, the faces she had never seen twice. And then she wrote something she had not written before. She wrote, "I know now that I cannot simply record this. Recording is not enough anymore." She stared at that sentence for a long time. Then she turned to the last page of the notebook and wrote a single name at the top of an otherwise blank page. Reverend Samuel Whitaker. She had met him only twice. A northern minister who came through Baldwin County twice a year on a circuit that nobody questioned because nobody important paid enough attention to the movements of a preacher. He had kind eyes and the careful manner of a man who understood that kindness in certain parts of Georgia could get you killed. She wrote his name, and she underlined it. Reverend Samuel Whitaker arrived on a Wednesday in late August of 1838, the same way he always arrived, quietly, without announcement, his horse tired and his coat dusty from the road. He came to Baldwin County twice a year to preach at a small white church 3 miles from Sweetwater, and nobody with any power in that county had ever paid much attention to him.
because men like Jonathan Harper did not consider a traveling northern minister worth the energy of suspicion. That was the first mistake Jonathan Harper ever made about Samuel Whitaker. Elizabeth had been watching for him for 3 weeks. She had positioned herself near the front of the property on the mornings she calculated he was likely to pass, using the excuse of checking the kitchen garden to explain her presence there to anyone who asked. When she finally saw his horse come up the road, she walked toward him with the steady, unhurried pace of a woman who had rehearsed this moment so many times in her mind that she had worn the edges off her fear. She reached him before he turned toward the church road. "Reverend Whitaker," she said. He looked down at her from the saddle. His eyes were careful and quiet. "Mrs. Harper?" "I need to speak with you," she said. "Not here, not today, but soon, and privately." He studied her face for a moment, with the attentiveness of a man who had learned to read urgency in people who were not permitted to express it openly. Then he nodded once, very slightly, and said, "I will be at the church through Friday." That was all. He rode on. Elizabeth walked back toward the house with her heart hammering so loudly she was certain anyone watching her could hear it. She managed to reach Whitaker on Thursday afternoon, telling Jonathan she was visiting the wife of a neighboring landowner who had been ill. Jonathan barely looked up from his correspondence when she told him. He had been absorbed for days in a series of letters exchanged with Caldwell, who had returned to South Carolina but written 3 times in the 2 weeks since his departure. The letters were sealed, and Jonathan opened them privately, but Elizabeth had noticed that each one made him more energized, more purposeful, moving through the plantation with the tight, focused urgency of a man approaching the completion of something he had been building toward for a long time. She did not know yet what that something was. She found Whitaker alone in the small vestry at the back of the church, and she sat down across from him and placed the hidden notebook on the table between them without a word. He looked at it, then at her. "Read the last 40 pages, she said. He read for nearly an hour. He did not speak while he read. His expression did not change dramatically, but Elizabeth watched his jaw tighten progressively with each page he turned, the way a man's does when he is absorbing something that requires an enormous amount of discipline not to react to visibly. When he finished, he closed the book and set it down and folded his hands on top of it. "How long?" he asked. "Since December of 1836, she said. "And the children, the ones taken at night?" Hannah counted 7. She believes there were more before she was old enough to notice. Whitaker was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Harper," he said carefully, "I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me directly. Are you prepared for what happens if this goes further? To you personally. Do you understand what your husband is capable of?" "He has already threatened to have me committed," Elizabeth said. "He told me Dr. Perkins has papers prepared." Whitaker nodded slowly. "Then we have to move carefully, and we have to move soon." He looked at the notebook again. "This document cannot stay on that plantation." "I know," she said. "I have a contact in Milledgeville, a man who handles certain kinds of correspondence discreetly. If I can get copies of the most critical pages to him, along with your signed testimony, there are people in the North with both the interest and the resources to—" "There is something else," Elizabeth said. He stopped. She had not planned to tell him yet. She had been turning it over for 2 weeks, uncertain whether it changed anything or changed everything. But sitting across from the first person in 2 years who had looked at her like she was something other than Jonathan Harper's instrument, she found she could not hold it back. "There is a child on this plantation," she said. "A boy, 8 years old. His name is Daniel." Whitaker waited. "He is Jonathan's son," she said, "by one of the women." Jonathan has been educating him privately, reading, mathematics. He keeps the boy in a cabin at the edge of the south field, away from the quarters. I was not supposed to know the child existed.
I found out by accident 6 months ago when I followed one of the house servants who was carrying books in a direction that made no sense." Whitaker's expression shifted very slightly. Why would Harper educate an enslaved child? Elizabeth looked at him steadily.
"Because he does not intend for Daniel to remain enslaved," she said. "Not exactly. Jonathan's plan, as best as I have been able to understand it from what I have overheard and what Caldwell has written, is that Daniel is to be prepared, educated, made fluent and capable, and when he is old enough, Jonathan intends to use him to father the next generation, children who can pass entirely, children who can be placed in situations where their origins are invisible." The silence in that small room was absolute. "Jonathan believes he is creating a legacy," Elizabeth said. "He believes Daniel is the proof that his experiment worked. The perfect result, he calls him. He has said it more than once." Whitaker sat back in his chair. For the first time since she had met him, he looked something close to shaken. "That child," he said quietly. "Does he know what his father intends for him?" "He is 8 years old," Elizabeth said. "He knows he is different from the other children on the plantation. He knows he is being taught things the others are not. Whether he understands why—" She stopped. "I don't know. I have only seen him twice, from a distance. Jonathan does not know I know about him." Whitaker pressed both hands flat on the table. "Then that child is in as much danger as anyone else on this plantation." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "He is." She rode back to Sweetwater in the late afternoon with a notebook tucked beneath her dress and a plan beginning to take shape that frightened her more than anything Jonathan had ever said to her. Because Jonathan's threats had always been directed at her. What she was planning now involved people who could not protect themselves. She was 3 days away from the house when Jonathan found the copy. Not the notebook. The notebook was still safe beneath the floorboard, but Elizabeth had made a handwritten summary of the key entries, names, dates, the description of the night wagons, Caldwell's words at dinner, the buyers in Havana and Rio. She had made it to give to Whitaker at their next meeting. She had hidden it inside the lining of a winter coat she had not worn in months, a coat that happened to be the one Jonathan pulled from the wardrobe on a cool September morning because the temperature had dropped overnight and his own coat was being mended. She was in the kitchen when she heard his footsteps change. She had learned, in 3 years of marriage, to read Jonathan's footsteps the way some people read weather. Their normal rhythm, their pace when he was distracted, their particular quality when something had gone wrong. The steps she heard coming down the hallway toward the kitchen that morning had a quality she had never heard before, and identified instantly as something worse than anger. She turned around. Jonathan was standing in the doorway, holding the folded pages. His face was absolutely still. "What is this?" he said. Not a question. Each word its own sentence. Elizabeth did not look away from him. "You know what it is. Where is the rest of it?" "There is no rest of it." He crossed the room in 4 steps and grabbed her wrist, and the cook, who had been standing at the far end of the kitchen, walked out without being told. The room was empty, except for the 2 of them. "Elizabeth," Jonathan said, and his voice was so quiet and so controlled that it was more frightening than shouting would have been. "I will ask you one more time. Where is the rest of it?" "There is nothing else," she said. Her voice was steady. She had not known until that moment that she was capable of that kind of steadiness. "Those are notes I made for myself. That is all." He looked at her for a very long time. She could see him calculating, measuring the probability that she was telling the truth, weighing what it would cost him to believe her against what it would cost him to disbelieve her. "If I find anything else," he said finally, "I will not give you a warning. Do you understand me? Not a warning, not a conversation. You will be gone from this house before the day is out." He released her wrist and walked out of the room. Elizabeth stood completely still for a moment. Then she looked down at her wrist,
at the red marks his fingers had left, and she felt something settle inside her. Something that had been uncertain and liquid for 2 years suddenly became solid and specific. She was not afraid anymore. She was decided.
That evening, after Jonathan had locked himself in his study with his correspondence, Elizabeth retrieved the notebook from beneath the floorboard and spent 2 hours writing the most complete, detailed, carefully organized summary she had yet produced. She wrote until her hand ached. She wrote until the candle burned low. She wrote every name, every date, every conversation, every wagon, every child. And at the bottom of the last page, in letters she pressed hard enough into the paper to nearly tear it, she wrote 2 sentences that she had been building toward for 2 years without knowing it.
My name is Elizabeth Harper. I am a witness. She delivered the notebook to Whitaker on a Friday morning in early October of 1838, 3 days after Jonathan found the copy and left those red marks on her wrist that had not fully faded yet. She did not write out this time. Writing out again so soon would have drawn attention she could not afford. Instead, she sent it through Hannah, wrapped in a piece of cloth inside a basket of preserves that Hannah carried to the church under the pretense of a charitable donation the plantation made twice a year. It was the most terrifying hour of Elizabeth's life.
She sat in her parlor and did not move and did not speak, and listened to every sound the house made while Hannah was gone, every creak of the floorboards above her where Jonathan was working, every voice from outside that might mean something had gone wrong on the road. Hannah came back exactly 50 minutes later. She set the empty basket on the kitchen table and looked at Elizabeth and gave the smallest possible nod. The notebook was with Whitaker. Elizabeth exhaled for what felt like the first time in 3 days, but relief, she had learned, was never more than a temporary condition at Sweetwater Plantation. Jonathan called her into his study that same afternoon. He was sitting behind his desk with his hands folded in front of him and a letter open beside him that she could not read from where she stood. He looked at her with the particular expression he used when he wanted her to understand that he had already decided everything and was only informing her as a formality. "Caldwell is returning," he said. "He will be here within the fortnight. He is bringing 2 associates from Havana." He paused. "The arrangements we have been planning are moving into their final stage." Elizabeth kept her face absolutely still. "What arrangements?" "The transfer of 6 children from this plantation to buyers Caldwell has identified. It will happen quickly and quietly. The transactions will be recorded as standard sales." He looked at her with those flat, measuring eyes. "I am telling you this because I need the ledger updated before he arrives. I need every entry current and complete." She stared at him. 6 children. She ran the count in her head immediately and without meaning to. 6 children. She knew which 6. She had written all of their names in the hidden notebook, the one now sitting with Whitaker 3 miles away, and the knowledge that those names were no longer only in her possession was the only thing that kept her voice from shaking when she spoke. "When does Caldwell arrive?" she asked. 2 weeks, perhaps less." She nodded once and left the room. She walked directly to the kitchen, told the cook she needed air, walked out the back, went around the side of the laundry building, and stood with both hands pressed against the wooden wall and breathed in and out until the dizziness passed. 2 weeks. She had 2 weeks. She spent the next 4 days doing something she had not done in almost 2 years of recording and documenting and surviving inside this marriage. She went looking for Daniel. She had seen the boy twice before, both times from a distance, and both times she had pulled back before getting close because she had been afraid Jonathan would somehow know she had been there. But the conversation with Whitaker had changed something in her. The boy was 8 years old. He was being educated in a cabin at the edge of the South Field for the specific purpose of being used in a way that would consume the rest of his life. He was Jonathan's blood and Jonathan's property and Jonathan's plan, all in the same small body. And he had no idea. She found him on a Tuesday afternoon. He was sitting outside the cabin with a book open in his lap. A real book, she noticed, not a primer, something with dense text and a worn cover. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and she saw his face clearly for the first time. He had Jonathan's coloring and his mother's eyes, and the careful, self-contained expression of a child who had learned very early that the world around him required constant reading. He did not run. He did not call out. He just watched her approach with those steady eyes and waited. "You are Daniel," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She crouched down so she was level with him. She had not planned what to say. She had told herself she only wanted to see him, to confirm what she knew, to make his existence real to herself in a way that went beyond the entries she had read in Caldwell's letters. But looking at his face, she found herself saying something she had not intended. "Do you know who I am?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "You are the mistress of the house," he said. "Mr. Harper's wife." "Yes," she said. "And I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you not to tell anyone that I came here. Can you do that?" He studied her for a moment with an intelligence that was startling in someone so young. "Are you going to tell me something bad?" he asked. She held his gaze. "I am going to tell you something true," she said, "which sometimes is the same thing." She did not tell him everything. He was 8 years old, and there were things no 8-year-old should carry. But she told him enough. She told him that men were coming to the plantation soon, and that when they came, he should not go anywhere with anyone he did not know, regardless of what he was told. She told him that if anyone came to the cabin at night and tried to take him somewhere, he should run to the quarters and find Hannah and say her name. He listened to every word without moving. When she finished, he looked at her for a long moment and said, "Why are you telling me this?" She did not have a clean answer. She had a complicated one that involved 2 years of guilt and a hidden notebook and a decision made at a kitchen table when she looked down at the marks on her wrist and finally understood that recording was not enough. But he was 8 years old, and she gave him the truest version she could compress into a single sentence. "Because no one told me when I needed to know," she said. She stood up and walked back toward the house. That evening, Jonathan came to her with the ledger and asked why it had not been updated. She sat down and updated it. She wrote every entry he dictated in her careful, clear handwriting, and while she wrote, she was thinking about Whitaker, and about whether 3 miles and a basket of preserves was enough distance to protect what she had built over 2 years of silence. It was not. Whitaker sent word through Hannah 4 days later. Not in writing. He sent a verbal message, 3 sentences delivered in a flat, urgent tone that Hannah repeated to Elizabeth word for word in the narrow passage beside the laundry where they had spoken before. The message was, "The contact in Milledgeville has the documents. There are people moving. It will not be quiet." Elizabeth stood very still when she heard those words. It will not be quiet. She had understood for a long time, in the abstract, that whatever she was building with the notebook would eventually produce consequences she could not fully control. But consequences had always been a future problem, a distant thing she kept on the other side of a wall in her mind. Hearing those 3 sentences, she felt that wall come down. It was not going to be quiet, and Caldwell was arriving in 10 days. Jonathan found out on a Thursday. She never learned exactly how, whether someone had been watching Whitaker, or whether the contact in Milledgeville had talked to the wrong person, or whether one of the letters had been intercepted somewhere along the road between Baldwin County and wherever it was going. All she knew was that Jonathan came home in the late afternoon of a Thursday in mid-October with a face she had never seen on him before. Not controlled, not calculating. Something rawer than both. He walked into the house and straight to her sitting room and stood in the doorway and looked at her and said, "What have you done?" She stood up. She had been preparing for this moment in some part of her mind for 2 years. She had rehearsed it at 2 in the morning with a candle burning low. She had rehearsed it while writing names in the hidden notebook. She had rehearsed it in every moment of stillness she had managed to find inside this marriage. And now it was here, and she discovered that all that rehearsal had given her something she had not expected. Not courage exactly. Clarity. "I have done what needed to be done," she said. Jonathan crossed the room in 3 steps. "You have destroyed everything," he said, and his voice had the particular quality of a man who is trying to hold himself together and failing. "Do you understand what you have done? There are men involved in this who will not simply walk away. Caldwell has partners. The buyers are not patient people. If this falls apart now—" "If this falls apart," Elizabeth said, "then the children go home." He stared at her. "The children come home," she said again. "Daniel stays on this plantation. The women are not selected anymore. The ledger closes, and you never speak to Caldwell again." "You are not in a position to make demands," he said.
"I am the only person in Georgia with a signed, dated, witnessed account of every transaction you and Caldwell have planned for the last 2 years," she said. "The names of the buyers, the descriptions of the children, the night wagons, Hannah's testimony, all of it. It is not in this house. It is not somewhere you can find it.
And if anything happens to me, if I disappear, if I am committed, if I fall ill in any way that seems convenient, that document reaches every newspaper and courthouse between here and Washington." She paused. "So yes, Jonathan, I am exactly in a position to make demands." The silence that followed was the longest of her life. Jonathan stood in front of her, and she watched something happen in his face that she had never seen before. The calculation she knew so well was still there, but beneath it, for the first time, there was something that looked almost like fear. He left the room without another word. The breeding program stopped that week. No more women were selected. Caldwell arrived as planned, stayed less than 2 days, and left without completing any transaction. Elizabeth never learned exactly what Jonathan told him. She only knew that the wagons did not come that October, or the October after that. Daniel remained in his cabin on the south field. Elizabeth began sending books with Hannah, then lessons. Then, when Jonathan's health began its slow decline in 1841, she walked to the cabin herself and sat across from the boy, who was no longer 8 years old, but 11, and reading at a level that startled her, and she taught him herself. Jonathan Harper died in the spring of 1843 at the age of 51. His heart, the doctor said. Elizabeth stood at his graveside with the women of the plantation around her, and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not relief, not grief, something quieter than both. The particular weight of a war that had ended not with victory, but with survival. She inherited Sweetwater Plantation entirely. The first thing she did was find the official ledger and lock it in a chest. The second thing she did was walk to Daniel's cabin and tell him clearly and directly that no one was coming for him anymore. The third thing she did was begin, quietly and carefully, to use the plantation's resources to purchase the freedom of every woman whose name appeared in the notebook. It took years. Some had already been sold and could not be found. Some were found and brought back to Baldwin County as free people. Hannah stayed. Mary stayed, and Thomas, who was 6 years old by then and had his mother's quick intelligence and his own serious eyes. Elizabeth made sure Thomas was educated. She made sure every child she could reach was educated. She never published the documents while she was alive. She was not certain the world she lived in was ready to hear them without destroying her and everyone she had tried to protect before a single line could be acted upon. Instead, before her death in 1854, she had the chest containing both notebooks, the official ledger, her personal diary, and a signed, witnessed statement of testimony, sealed and placed in the care of a legal firm in Milledgeville, with instructions that it not be opened for 100 years. The chest was opened in 1954. The historians who examined it described what they found as one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of systematic abuse and human trafficking within the antebellum plantation system ever discovered. A document created not by an abolitionist from the North or a journalist pursuing a story, but by a woman who had been placed inside the machinery of that system by marriage and had chosen, at enormous personal risk, to become its recorder rather than its instrument. Her name was Elizabeth Harper. She was not a hero in the way that word is usually used. She waited too long. She recorded when she should have acted, and stayed silent when she should have spoken, and lived inside a system she benefited from in ways she never fully escaped. The women whose names she wrote down suffered things she witnessed and documented and could not stop. But she wrote their names, every one of them: Hannah, Mary, Lydia, Thomas, Daniel. 7 children taken in the night, whose names she listed on a single page, with dates and descriptions, and the word "taken" written beside each one in letters that did not waver. She wrote their names when no one else did, and she kept writing until the truth was too large and too documented and too witnessed to be buried. That is not justice. But in Sweetwater Plantation, in the winter of 1838, in a world designed to make these people invisible, it was the one thing she had, and she used it.